The mansion rose from the Connecticut countryside like a monument to power, its limestone walls washed in early morning light, its columns standing like watchmen of a kingdom no one could touch. From a distance, it looked perfect, grand, symmetrical, untouched by time. But inside, the air was cold. Every piece of furniture had been placed with mathematical precision. Every Persian rug aligned so straight it felt unnatural. Paintings worth millions stared down from the walls, their colors rich but their presence suffocating. The house didn't breathe like a home should. It echoed. It loomed. It was beautiful, yes, but beautiful in the way a museum is, where everything is preserved, but nothing is alive. Richard Hale, master of this cold kingdom, moved through the halls like a man rehearsing perfection. At 45, tall and sharply dressed in tailored suits that cost more than most people made in a month, he carried himself like someone who had built walls so high that even grief couldn't climb them. Since the day he buried his wife, laughter had vanished from the mansion. In its place, he had built order. Order was his fortress. Order was how he survived. He gave his staff 3 rules, written into contracts and repeated until no one dared to forget. Rule 1, maintain professional distance. Rule 2, never overstep. Rule 3, absolutely no physical affection with his daughter. They were rules carved in stone, rules that seemed to whisper through the marble hallways. They were not guidelines, they were commandments. And so everyone kept their distance from Clara Hale. Everyone except one woman. Evelyn Walker moved with quiet purpose as she polished silverware in the dining room that morning. At 32, she had the kind of dignity that wasn't learned from books, but forged from struggle. Her dark skin glowed softly under the chandeliers, her eyes carrying both gentleness and a history she rarely spoke about. She had been raised by a grandmother who worked 2 jobs and believed respect wasn't earned by wealth, but by how you carried yourself when no one was watching. Evelyn carried that legacy with her every step. She wasn't just a maid. She was a protector of small things, of warmth, of kindness, of moments easily lost in houses like this. She'd been here only 6 months, but she already knew how suffocating silence could be. She had seen the way staff members avoided eye contact with Clara, afraid of breaking the rules. She had noticed how Richard's presence made them bow their heads, afraid even to breathe too loudly. Evelyn didn't challenge those rules outright, but something in her heart rebelled every time she saw the little girl left alone at the long mahogany table, staring at food she barely touched. Clara was 10 years old, a small figure in her custom wheelchair, with strawberry blonde hair that caught the light like fire and eyes the exact shade of green as her mother's. Her body was fragile, her legs too weak to carry her, but her spirit burned with a brightness that no illness could dim. She longed for something this house never gave her: warmth, a laugh, a hand to hold when the nights grew too quiet. She had once asked her father if she could sit on his lap just to feel close to him. He had looked at her with a face carved from stone and reminded her of the rules. No exceptions, Clara. Boundaries keep us safe. Safe. That was the word Richard used, but Clara felt anything but safe. She felt invisible. And so Evelyn became her shadow of comfort. A smile when no one was looking. A soft word slipped through the silence. A glance that said, "I see you." She was careful, always careful, because she knew one wrong move could cost her everything. Still, she couldn't ignore the pull. The child reminded her of her own brother, long gone now, who had once looked at her the same way, hungry for someone to just stay. The Hale mansion, in all its wealth and glory, was starving of love, starving of connection, and everyone inside it seemed resigned to that fate, everyone except Evelyn Walker and the girl who whispered her name in the dark. Richard believed rules kept the cracks sealed, but cracks always widen, and sometimes it takes the smallest act of rebellion, a hug, a whispered promise, to bring the walls crashing down. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the East Garden, bathing the marble floors in warm light that somehow never reached the people inside. Clara sat in her wheelchair by the fountain, her quilt tucked neatly around her legs, her green eyes fixed on the spray of water, as if she could find freedom in the droplets. She hadn't spoken much all day. Her tutors had left frustrated, her lunch remained untouched, and even the butler's gentle coaxing had been met with silence. Evelyn noticed. She always noticed. Moving across the garden path with a basket of linens in her arms, she studied the girl quietly. Clara's shoulders sagged in defeat, her small hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Evelyn's instinct, the one that had been born the day her younger brother leaned on her for strength, tugged at her heart. She wanted to kneel, to take Clara's hand, to tell her that she wasn't invisible, but Richard's rules loomed in her mind like iron bars. No personal attachment, no overstepping, no affection. Still, She could not walk away. "What's the matter, honey?" Evelyn asked softly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to cut through the stillness. Clara blinked at her, startled. No one in this house used words like honey. Not the staff, not the tutors, certainly not her father. For a moment she hesitated, then her lips trembled. "I dreamed last night that I could walk, that I was running in the park, and Father was laughing, but when I woke up..." She shook her head, biting her lip to keep from crying. "I hate waking up." Evelyn's chest ached at the words. She set the basket down and crouched to Clara's level, her voice gentle but firm. "Dreams aren't lies, Clara. Sometimes they're reminders of what's still worth fighting for." "I don't feel like fighting," Clara whispered. "I feel like I don't matter. He barely looks at me anymore. Everyone just walks past me, like I'm furniture." Her tears finally spilled over, quiet at first, then heavy, sobbing tears that shook her small frame. Evelyn froze. She knew she should stay still, should let the girl cry alone. That's what the rules demanded, distance. But the sound of Clara's sobs pierced her like a knife. She remembered the night her brother Marcus had begged her not to leave his side when pain racked his body. She remembered promising him she would never let someone she loved feel alone in their hurt. And now this little girl was begging without words, drowning in silence. Evelyn leaned forward and wrapped her arms around Clara. It wasn't calculated, it wasn't cautious, it was instinct. Clara clung to her instantly, burying her face in Evelyn's shoulder, her small hands gripping the fabric of Evelyn's uniform like she might never let go. "I see you," Evelyn whispered into the child's hair. "You're not invisible. You're brave, and you're loved. Don't you ever believe otherwise." For the first time in weeks, Clara's sobs softened. She rested in Evelyn's arms, trembling less with each breath. For a fleeting moment, warmth returned to the Hale mansion, a warmth so powerful it almost felt holy. And then a voice cut through the air like a whip. "What the hell is going on here?" Evelyn froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. She turned slowly. Richard Hale stood at the edge of the garden path, his suit jacket buttoned, his phone still in his hand, his face contorted with rage. Behind him, 3 business associates, polished men in tailored suits, stared at the scene with raised brows, curiosity and judgment written all over their expressions. Evelyn released Clara at once and stood, trembling. "Mr. Hale, don't you dare!" Richard snapped, striding forward with the power of a man who believed he owned the ground he walked on. He positioned himself between Clara and Evelyn as though shielding his daughter from a predator. His eyes burned. "You were told the rules, professional distance, no overstepping, no affection." "Father, please." Clara's voice broke as she tried to wheel forward, her small hands reaching. She was just... "Enough!" Richard's voice thundered across the garden, silencing everyone. He didn't look at his daughter. His gaze was locked on Evelyn, cold and final. "Pack your things. You're finished here. Security will escort you off the property within the hour." Clara's cry echoed across the garden. "No, don't do this!" Tears streaked her face as she tried to push past his legs, reaching desperately for the woman who had finally made her feel seen. But Richard Hale did not bend. He didn't falter. In his eyes, Evelyn had broken the one rule that mattered most. She had given his daughter what he himself could not: comfort. Evelyn's voice shook, but she stood her ground. "Mr. Hale," Clara was crying. "You're fired," he said again, sharper, like steel slamming shut. Clara screamed, her sobs so raw they cut through the autumn air, begging, pleading, but Richard's jaw was set like stone. Evelyn felt her world collapse around her. She had given comfort where it was needed most, and for that, she was being thrown out like trash. But deep down, beneath the humiliation, beneath the hurt, one truth pulsed steady in her heart. Clara needed her, and no matter what Richard Hale believed, this was not the end. The Hale mansion was quieter than usual that night, though silence had always been its natural state. This time, however, the silence felt heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. The staff moved through the halls with lowered eyes, their footsteps softer than normal, as if the marble floors might betray them if they dared to make a sound. Everyone had seen what happened in the garden. Everyone had heard Richard Hale's voice thunder like Judgment Day. And everyone had watched Evelyn Walker, her dignity intact but her face pale with hurt, walk back into the house to pack her belongings. Upstairs, Clara sat in her wheelchair with her quilt pulled tightly around her small frame, her eyes swollen from crying. She hadn't touched her dinner. She hadn't spoken a word to the butler or the temporary maid who tried to coax her with gentle tones. She just sat at the window, staring into the night as if she could will Evelyn's figure to reappear on the driveway below. The ache in her chest was too much for words. Her father had taken the one person who made her feel like more than a chair with wheels, more than an obligation. In the garage apartment, Evelyn folded her few belongings into a worn suitcase. A photograph of her brother Marcus lay on top, his smile frozen in time, reminding her why she had come here in the first place: to earn, to live, to keep a promise, to always carry the kind of love that had been denied to him. Her hands trembled as she packed, not because of fear for herself, but because of Clara. The image of the girl clinging to her in the garden replayed in her mind, raw and desperate. Evelyn had promised to be careful. She had promised to stay as long as she could. And now she was leaving, not because she wanted to, but because she dared to care. Back in the main house, Richard sat in his study, a glass of scotch untouched beside him, his laptop open but ignored. He told himself he had done the right thing. Boundaries protected Clara. Boundaries kept her from becoming dependent on people who would inevitably leave. That was what he believed. That was what he repeated in his mind like a mantra. And yet, when he closed his eyes, all he saw was his daughter's face twisted in grief, her little voice screaming, "I hate you!" Those words lingered like a wound he couldn't bandage. He lifted the glass but set it down again. Scotch couldn't wash away the truth. Clara refused to see him when he went upstairs later. She locked her door, and when he demanded she open it, her reply was quiet but sharp. "You already took everything from me today. What else is there left to take?" Richard walked away, his heart pounding though he wouldn't admit it. His rules, the ones that had built this house into a fortress, were beginning to crack. That night, long after midnight, Clara wheeled herself down the quiet hallways. Her hands shook as she clutched a small card Evelyn had slipped into her palm before leaving, an emergency number written in neat script. Clara pressed it to her chest, whispering into the darkness, "You promised you wouldn't leave me. Please, please don't let this be the end." The mansion, for all its grandeur, had never felt so empty. Richard believed he had restored order, but in reality, the walls he had built were beginning to close in. Clara's silence was not peace, it was rebellion. Evelyn's absence was not erasure, it was a wound. And though Richard couldn't see it yet, the storm he feared most had already begun. The morning light slipped into the grand dining room, painting golden stripes across the polished mahogany table. A spread had been laid out as always, fresh fruit arranged like art, artisanal breads. Stacked in neat baskets, crystal glasses filled with orange juice that caught the light like amber. It looked perfect, too perfect, the kind of perfection that had no soul behind it. Clara sat slumped in her wheelchair at the far end of the table, her small hands folded in her lap. She stared at the food, her lips pressed in a hard line. Across from her, the new maid, Susan Fletcher, stood nervously. She was young, timid, and had been warned by the butler Thomas not to get too close. "Remember the rules," he'd whispered. "Always remember the rules." Richard Hale entered at exactly 7:30, his routine unchanged even as the house itself felt hollow. His suit was dark gray, pressed so sharply it seemed it could cut glass. His expression gave nothing away as he took his seat at the head of the table, opening his newspaper with the mechanical precision of a man who found comfort in routine. "Good morning, Clara," he said without looking up. Clara didn't answer. Richard lowered the paper slowly, his gaze flicking toward her. "Clara, acknowledge when you are spoken to." "Good morning," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "That's better," Richard replied, though nothing in his tone softened. He nodded toward her untouched plate. "Eat. Proper nutrition is essential if you want your therapy to be effective." "I'm not hungry," she said, her voice sharp this time. Richard's jaw tightened. "You will eat." He tapped the newspaper. "Mrs. Peaton already informed me you were unfocused in lessons yesterday. That stops today." Clara's green eyes burned with something between anger and despair. She grabbed a piece of dry toast, glaring at him as if daring him to push further. Without buttering it, she shoved it into her mouth, biting off a chunk larger than she could manage. She chewed furiously, her small hands gripping the table edge. It happened quickly. Too quickly. The bread lodged in her throat, too dry, too thick. Her chewing stopped, her eyes widened. She tried to swallow, but nothing moved. Her hands flew to her throat, clawing in panic. A horrible wheezing sound filled the room as her face flushed red, then purple. "Clara?" Richard said sharply, rising to his feet. "Clara!" She couldn't answer. Her lips turned blue as she struggled for breath. The wheelchair rocked as her small body convulsed in desperation. Susan froze, her hands trembling. "Oh my God, oh my God!" She turned in circles, helpless. "Call 911!" Richard roared, rushing around the table. He slapped Clara's back, his movements frantic, but the angle was wrong. Nothing worked. Panic overtook him, stripping away his usual icy control. He pulled at the straps of her chair, trying to lift her, but his hands shook too badly. He could only watch as his daughter's eyes bulged in terror. Staff came running from the kitchen, drawn by the shouting, but no one knew what to do. Clara's wheezing grew weaker. Her small hands dropped from her throat. Stillness began to set in. "No," Richard cried, his voice breaking for the first time in years. "No, stay with me, Clara, please." And then, "Move!" The words sliced through the chaos, commanding and steady. Heads turned toward the doorway. Evelyn Walker stood there, her uniform gone, her clothes simple, her face set in fierce determination. She had come back only to retrieve a locket left in the garden shed. Her mother's locket, the only thing she had of value. But when she heard the screams from inside the house, she hadn't hesitated. She crossed the room in 3 strides, pushing past Richard. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around Clara from behind, positioned herself with precision, and thrust her fists into the girl's abdomen. Once, twice, 3 times. The third thrust worked. A chunk of toast flew out, landing on the pristine white tablecloth. Clara gasped, her chest heaving as air rushed back into her lungs. She coughed violently, her little body trembling. And then, weak but desperate, she reached for Evelyn's hand. "You came back," she whispered through sobs. "You came back." Evelyn sank to her knees beside the wheelchair, smoothing Clara's hair back, her own eyes burning with tears. "I told you I'd be here if you needed me, honey. I told you." Behind them, Richard Hale stood frozen. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms and silenced men twice his age was powerless, his daughter's life saved by the very woman he had thrown out like trash only hours earlier. His face was pale as marble, his eyes locked on Evelyn, not with anger now, but with something that looked very much like fear. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Clara's ragged breaths. Everyone in that room understood in that moment that the rules Richard had built his fortress upon had shattered. The dining room still smelled faintly of toast, though the chunk that had nearly taken Clara's life lay discarded on the table like a piece of evidence from a crime scene. The staff hovered in the background, wide-eyed, whispering in shock, their gazes darting between the billionaire who had built his life on rules and the woman kneeling on the floor who had just broken every one of them to save a child. Evelyn cradled Clara's trembling hands, her own heart racing but her voice steady. "Breathe with me, sweetheart. In and out. Nice and slow." She demonstrated, her chest rising and falling, her tone calm, almost musical. Clara followed, shaky at first, then more controlled, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. "You're safe now," Evelyn whispered, brushing the girl's damp hair back from her forehead. "You're safe." Richard stood a few feet away, silent, his phone buzzing unanswered in his pocket. His face, usually so rigid with authority, was pale and unsettled. He had watched his daughter nearly die, and all his wealth, all his power had been useless. It was Evelyn, the woman he dismissed with cold finality, who had acted, who had saved Clara without hesitation. Clara turned her tear-streaked face toward her father, still clinging to Evelyn. Her voice was hoarse but determined. "She saved me. Father, she saved me." Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The words lodged in his throat the way the toast had lodged in Clara's. He felt stripped bare before his staff, before his daughter, before the woman he had judged unworthy of compassion. "Water," Evelyn called firmly, not looking at him, but at Thomas, the butler. He moved at once, returning with a glass. Evelyn lifted it to Clara's lips with infinite care, letting her take small sips. Every action she took was measured, intentional, as though Clara's life depended on it still. "Easy," she murmured. "No rush, just little sips." When Clara had finished, she leaned back against her chair, exhausted but calmer. Her small fingers gripped Evelyn's hand like it was the only anchor in a storm. "Don't leave me again," she whispered, her eyes full of desperate truth. Evelyn pressed a kiss to her knuckles before she could stop herself. "I won't, honey. Not while you need me." The room went still. Staff exchanged glances, shock flashing across their faces at the sight of what Richard had outlawed. Open affection. Richard's throat tightened. He saw his daughter holding on to Evelyn as though letting go meant slipping back into death's shadow. He saw the staff watching him, judgment in their eyes. He saw for the first time the collapse of the walls he had spent years fortifying. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "Thank you!" It was quiet, almost foreign, like a man speaking in a language he hadn't used in years. Evelyn looked up at him, her face unreadable. She didn't answer, not to him. Her focus stayed on Clara. Richard stepped closer, his eyes searching Evelyn's. "You saved her life. He stopped, his voice faltering. He wasn't a man who faltered. I should never have... This isn't about you, Evelyn interrupted softly, her tone respectful but sharp. It's about Clara. She needs care. She needs warmth. She needs more than rules. The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, it looked as though Richard might argue, retreat to the safety of his walls. But Clara's small voice cut through his pride. She loves me, Clara whispered, looking directly at him. She's the only one who makes me feel like I matter. You fired her for hugging me, but she's the one who saved me when you couldn't. Richard's chest clenched. He wanted to defend himself, to say he had only been trying to protect her, but he couldn't form the lie. He had stood frozen, helpless. Evelyn had acted, and his daughter, his only child, saw the truth more clearly than anyone. From the doorway, his business partners, James Morrison and two other suited men who had arrived early for a meeting, stood watching, their faces unreadable but their eyes sharp. Richard realized too late that this moment wasn't private. It was being witnessed, and it would be remembered. Clara's grip on Evelyn tightened. Please, Father, don't send her away again. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it, his jaw working. He looked at Evelyn, at Clara, at the staff whose loyalty had always been unquestioned, but who now seemed united in silent disapproval. For the first time in years, Richard Hale, the man who had controlled empires, found himself cornered by something he couldn't buy, threaten, or command. The truth. And in that his rules shattered like glass. By nightfall, the story of what had happened in the Hale mansion was already spreading like wildfire. It began in hushed whispers among the staff, murmured in the kitchen while dishes clattered, or in the hallway when footsteps grew faint. She saved the girl's life, and he fired her only yesterday. Imagine, rules more important than his own child. The mansion, once a place of silent obedience, now hummed with quiet rebellion. Even Thomas, the ever-loyal butler, carried a stiffness in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He moved with his usual grace, but when he passed Richard in the corridor, his eyes lingered just a second too long, a flicker of disapproval that Richard, for all his efforts to ignore, felt like a blade. Outside the mansion walls, it didn't take long for the whispers to slip into the town. By morning, a neighbor who had a cousin working for one of the catering staff had told the story at the bakery. By noon, a post appeared on social media. Billionaire fires Maid for hugging disabled daughter. Next day, she saves the girl's life from choking. The post spread like lightning, drawing outrage, sympathy, and judgment in equal measure. In the boardrooms of Hale Industries, the scandal hit harder than any market dip. James Morrison, Richard's longest-standing business partner, stared across the polished conference table, his jaw tight. It's everywhere, he said, sliding a tablet across to Richard. Headlines blared on the screen. Heartless billionaire. Maid he fired saves disabled child. Comments piled beneath them, some furious, some mocking, all damning. Richard sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his tie knotted like a noose. It's exaggerated. James leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. Exaggerated or not, perception is reality in our world. Investors are calling me, asking if you've lost touch. They're not just worried about Clara, they're worried about judgment. Your judgment. Richard's stomach twisted, though his face betrayed nothing. He wanted to argue, to remind James that order kept the world from chaos, that rules had protected him and Clara since Martha's death. But the words felt hollow, even to him. He had watched his daughter choking, helpless, and it was Evelyn, not him, who had pulled her back from death. That image haunted him like a phantom. Back at the mansion, Clara had refused her lessons entirely. When the new tutor tried to coax her into arithmetic, she locked herself in her room and slid a note under the door. No Evelyn, no lessons. She ate little, spoke less, and whenever her father entered the room, she looked at him with eyes that were no longer filled with fear or even anger. They were filled with something worse, disappointment. Richard stood outside her door that evening, his hand hovering on the polished brass handle, his throat tight. He could hear her faintly, humming softly to herself, and he knew what tune it was. The lullaby Evelyn used to sing when Clara grew restless. He pressed his forehead against the door and closed his eyes, the weight of guilt settling heavier than the fortune he had built. In the kitchen, Thomas poured himself tea, his hand steady though his mind was not. The staff had gathered, voices hushed but firm. If she doesn't come back, one whispered, I'm handing in my notice. Me too, another said. The girl needs her. We all saw it. For the first time in years, loyalty to Richard Hale was cracking, and the one person who had caused it, the woman he had dismissed as nothing more than staff, was the same one who had become the heart of his daughter's world. Richard didn't know it yet, but the fortress he had built was collapsing from within. His rules, his control, his reputation, they were no longer unshakable. And soon the choice he feared, at most, would stand before him, swallow his pride and seek forgiveness, or watch everything, his company, his staff, his daughter, slip through his hands. The mansion had always been quiet, but in the days after the choking incident, the silence grew different, sharper, heavier, almost weaponized. Clara no longer filled the halls with questions or small bursts of laughter when Evelyn found a way to cheer her. Now her silence was deliberate, a shield she wielded against her father like the sharpest of blades. At breakfast, she sat at the long mahogany table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on her untouched plate. The scrambled eggs cooled, the toast remained untouched. Richard sat at the head of the table, his newspaper open but unread. He watched her, each passing second a reminder of how much control he no longer had. "Clara," he said at last, his voice low, "you need to eat." "Nothing." "Clara," he pressed, "ignoring me doesn't change the fact that your body requires food." Her head turned, her green eyes locking on his with a quiet fire. "I don't need food, I need her." Richard's stomach twisted. He tried to keep his tone even. "Miss Walker is gone. We've discussed this." "No," Clara said sharply. "You discussed it. I never agreed." The defiance stung, not because of her words, but because of the echo in them, Martha's echo. His late wife had carried that same spark in her voice when she challenged him, when she reminded him that love was more important than order. Richard forced himself to stay composed. "You're being childish." "I'm 10 years old," Clara shot back. "I'm supposed to be childish, but you—" Her voice cracked, tears filling her eyes. "You're supposed to be my father, and you're the one acting like a child." The words cut deeper than any insult could. Richard inhaled sharply, but before he could answer, Clara wheeled herself back from the table, the chair's motor whirring as she turned and sped toward the hallway. Thomas, standing by the doorway, stepped aside silently, his expression and unreadable, but his eyes heavy with disappointment. Later that day, Dr. Harrison arrived for Clara's checkup. Richard stood in the corner of her room as the physician urged Clara to take her medication. She shook her head, lips pressed together, arms crossed over her chest. "Clara, this isn't optional," Dr. Harrison said gently. "Your body needs these pills to keep your condition stable." Clara glared at her father. "Maybe I don't want to be stable. Maybe I'd rather be sick than live in a house where no one sees me." The doctor exchanged a glance with Richard, his face grim. "Mr. Hale, she's refusing. I can't force her. But if she continues like this—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. When the doctor left, Richard stood in the doorway watching his daughter turn her wheelchair toward the window. She looked so small against the vast emptiness of the room. "Clara," he said softly, almost pleading, "I'm doing this for you." "No," she whispered without turning. "You're doing it for you, because you're scared. You're scared of loving anyone enough to lose them." Her words hit him like a blow to the chest. He wanted to deny it, to remind her of rules and structure and boundaries. But all he could see was the reflection of his own fear staring back at him from his daughter's eyes. That night, Clara didn't come down for dinner. She didn't touch the tray left outside her door. She didn't answer when he knocked. Alone in his study, Richard poured himself another glass of scotch, but this time it didn't go down smooth. It burned, sharp and bitter, like the truth he could no longer outrun. For the first time in years, Richard Hale felt something he had buried long ago. Helplessness. The walls he had built were crumbling, and behind them, his daughter was slipping away. The night pressed down on the Hale mansion like a weight. Every room glowed with its perfect chandeliers, every surface gleamed from constant polishing, but the house felt emptier than ever. In her bedroom upstairs, Clara lay curled beneath her quilt, eyes wide open in the dark. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she refused to touch the tray of food left outside her door. The pills sat untouched on her bedside table. She was waging her war the only way she could, through silence, through refusal, through a stubbornness born not of rebellion, but of pain. Down in the study, Richard sat slouched in his leather chair, his tie loosened, his head in his hands. The glass of scotch on the desk stood untouched, the amber liquid catching the faint light of the lamp. His phone buzzed relentlessly, messages from investors, reminders of board meetings, warnings from his advisors, but he ignored them all. None of it mattered if Clara kept slipping further away from him. He could still hear her voice from earlier that day, sharp and unforgiving. "You're scared of loving anyone enough to lose them." The words had been like a knife cutting through every excuse he had carried for years. He had believed his walls made him strong, that control meant protection. But now? Now those walls had left his daughter starving for love, starving for presence, starving to be seen. Thomas appeared quietly in the doorway, his silver hair catching the lamplight. "She hasn't touched her dinner," he said softly, "or her medication." Richard rubbed his forehead. "I know. She won't last long like this," Thomas continued, his voice heavy with concern. "Forgive me for saying so, sir, but Miss Walker would have found a way to reach her." Richard's jaw clenched. He wanted to snap, to remind Thomas of his place, but the truth of it landed too heavily. Instead, he whispered, "She's already dying in front of me, Thomas, and I don't know how to stop it." Thomas stepped forward, laying a respectful but steady hand on the desk. "You can't fix this with money or rules or control. She doesn't need a master of the house, sir. She needs a father, and she needs the one person who made her feel loved." The words struck deep. Richard turned his eyes to the photograph on his desk, the one of Martha holding a laughing Clara as a baby. Martha's smile radiated warmth, the kind of warmth Evelyn carried every time she touched Clara's hand, every time she looked at her not as a patient or a burden, but as a little girl who deserved joy. Richard had tried to erase that kind of love from the house, convinced it was dangerous, convinced it would lead only to more heartbreak. But watching Clara fade had shown him the cost of his pride. Upstairs, Clara sat by the window in her wheelchair, her thin arms wrapped around herself. Her small voice trembled as she whispered into the dark, "Miss Evie, you promised you wouldn't leave me." She pressed the emergency card Evelyn had given her against her chest. She wanted to call, but she was afraid her father would find out, afraid she would make things worse. In the study, Richard stood abruptly, pushing the chair back with sudden force. His reflection stared at him from the window, and for once he didn't see the powerful billionaire. He saw a man stripped of excuses, standing on the edge of losing everything. He pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over James Morrison's number, then shifted to another name he had not dared to search in days. Evelyn Walker. His breath caught. Swallowing hard, he typed a single message, his hands trembling as he hit send. "Please, Clara needs you. I can't reach her." For the first time in 6 years, Richard Hale admitted to himself and to the world that he could not do it alone. The mansion, still and silent, seemed to exhale with him, as though the first crack in his fortress had finally let in a sliver of light. The text had been sent in a moment of desperation, the kind of plea Richard Hale never thought himself capable of making. For hours afterward, he paced the marble floors of his study, checking his phone, hating himself for waiting on a response that might never come. Outside, the night deepened, the storm clouds gathering until rain streaked the mansion's tall windows. The house groaned with the weight of its silence. It was past midnight when the doorbell rang. The chime echoed through the empty halls like a lifeline. Richard froze, breath caught in his throat. He hadn't dared believe she would come. Thomas appeared first, moving briskly toward the door. When he pulled it open, Evelyn Walker stood there, drenched from the rain, her dark curls plastered to her forehead. She carried no luggage, no umbrella, just herself, her coat soaked through, and an expression that burned with quiet resolve. Richard moved toward her slowly, as if afraid she might vanish if he stepped too quickly. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse. Evelyn's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "I didn't come for you," she said. "I came for Clara." Behind her words was something Richard couldn't ignore, an edge of truth sharp enough to pierce the armor he still clung to. He stepped aside without another word, and Evelyn entered, water dripping onto the pristine marble floor. For once, Richard didn't care about the mess. Clara's door opened upstairs, the creak of her wheelchair wheels echoing faintly. "Miss Evie?" Her voice trembled, uncertain if her ears were betraying her. Evelyn's expression softened instantly. She hurried to the staircase, her shoes squeaking against the marble, and within moments she was kneeling in front of Clara, who had wheeled herself halfway down in her nightgown. "Sweetheart," Evelyn whispered, reaching up to clasp her hands. "I'm here. I'm so sorry it took me is long." Clara burst into tears, the sobs racking her thin frame as she clung to Evelyn's hands with everything she had left. "I thought you'd never come back. I promised you," Evelyn said, pulling her close despite the awkward angle of the wheelchair. "I told you I'd be here if you needed me, and I meant it." Richard stood at the bottom of the staircase watching the scene unfold. His chest ached with something sharp and unfamiliar. Shame, gratitude, love tangled into a knot too heavy to carry. He saw the way Clara's small body leaned into Evelyn, how her tears turned to relief as if Evelyn's presence alone breathed life back into her. Clara pulled back slightly, her green eyes bright with desperation. "Don't leave again, please don't." Evelyn brushed a tear from the girl's cheek. "Not while you need me, honey. Not ever like this." For the first time in weeks, Clara smiled, small but real. It was like watching sunlight break through storm clouds. Evelyn's hand remained on hers, grounding her, steadying her in a way Richard hadn't been able to. The staff gathered quietly in the hall, their faces filled with awe. Whispers rippled through them. She's back. Thank God. The girl might survive now. Richard felt their eyes on him. He knew what they were thinking, that Evelyn's return wasn't his triumph, but his salvation, that he had nearly destroyed the very thing that gave his daughter a reason to fight. He cleared his throat, the words catching before they left his lips. Miss Walker. His voice broke, and he forced himself to start again. Evelyn, I owe you more than thanks. I owe you everything. Evelyn glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. You don't owe me anything. You owe her. She nodded toward Clara. You owe her your presence, your heart, your courage to be a father, not just a man with rules. The words landed like a verdict. Each one true, each one impossible to ignore. Richard lowered his head, humbled in a way he hadn't been since Martha's death. Clara, still clinging to Evelyn, turned her tear-streaked face to her father. Please, Father, don't send her away again. Richard's voice cracked. I won't, not ever again. And for the first time in years, his daughter believed him. Morning broke gray and heavy over the Hale estate, the kind of sky that pressed low as though the world itself was holding its breath. In his study, Richard sat at his desk, his phone buzzing with relentless urgency. Calls from James Morrison, emails from investors, reminders from his assistant that the board meeting was only hours away. His empire teetered on the edge, yet for the first time in years, business wasn't the only weight in his chest. Upstairs, Clara was laughing. The sound was faint, but it carried through the corridors like sunlight cracking through stone. Richard had heard it while passing her door, Evelyn's voice soothing and playful, Clara giggling as though the storm of the last week had never happened. That laugh, his daughter's laugh, was something money couldn't buy, and Richard knew in his bones that Evelyn Walker had given it back to her. But outside these walls, the world was circling. The scandal had spread too far, too fast. News headlines screamed of hypocrisy, of cruelty, of a billionaire blinded by pride, while a dismissed maid saved his daughter's life. Investors whispered about pulling their money. The board was preparing for a vote of no confidence. His fortune, his company, his reputation, all of it was slipping through his fingers. He stood at the window, staring out at the manicured gardens where he had once barked orders, where he had fired Evelyn like she was disposable. That same place now mocked him with memory, the moment he realized his rules had nearly killed his daughter. He pressed a hand against the cold glass. His reflection staring back at him, a man who had gained the world but nearly lost the only thing that mattered. Evelyn entered quietly, her steps measured, her presence steady. She carried a tray, Clara's untouched medication, a glass of water, and a folded note in small, careful handwriting. She set the tray on the desk without a word, but Richard noticed her fingers linger on the note. He picked it up, his throat tightening as he read, Father, I took them because she asked me to, not because of you, but I want you to know, I'm trying, because she believes in me. Maybe one day, I'll believe in you too. The words pierced him deeper than any headline. His daughter's faith no longer rested in him. It belonged to Evelyn, the woman he had treated like less than human. Richard swallowed hard, his voice low. She took them? Evelyn nodded. Because she trusts me. But Richard. She said his name firmly, almost forcing him to look at her. She needs you. Not the man with rules and walls. She needs her father. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he picked up his phone, staring at the screen where James Morrison's name glowed. His empire demanded an answer. His pride demanded control. But then, faintly, Clara's laugh echoed again through the halls, cutting through the storm of his thoughts. He pressed decline. I'm going to that board meeting, he said, finally looking at Evelyn, but not to save my title. If they want me gone, they can take it. I'll stand before them and tell the truth, that I was wrong, that I let pride matter more than love, that I nearly lost my daughter because I couldn't see the value in the very person who saved her. Evelyn's expression softened, though her eyes still held fire. And if they strip everything from you? Then so be it, Richard said quietly, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. If I have Clara, if I have a chance to earn back her trust, that will be enough. Evelyn studied him, searching for cracks, for insincerity. But for once, Richard Hale wasn't a fortress. He was just a man, humbled and broken, finally ready to be rebuilt. Later that afternoon, as he stood in the boardroom facing 12 stern faces, Richard knew his future balanced on a knife's edge. His company, his fortune, his name, all of it hung in the balance. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. "I built this empire on rules and control," he began, "but rules nearly cost me my daughter's life. It was Evelyn Walker who saved her, not just from choking, but from the loneliness I created. If you believe that disqualifies me from leading this company, then vote me out. But if you believe that true leadership means having the courage to change, then let me show you what redemption looks like." Silence followed, silence so heavy it felt like the whole world was deciding. Back at the mansion, Clara sat at the window, holding Evelyn's hand. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked softly. Evelyn brushed a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. "One way or another, Clara, he'll come back. But this time, maybe as the father you've been waiting for." And in that moment, the storm that had nearly destroyed them all hung on the edge of transformation.